Just when it seemed U.S. tariffs had Canada cornered, Ottawa quietly partnered with Mexico on a sweeping economic pact that sidestepped Trump's protectionism entirely. This deal elevated both nations beyond reactive measures and reshaped North American trade in ways that stunned Washington. Although Canada and Mexico had long shared ties under NAFTA, this new accord was different. It linked interprovincial and interstate production lines directly. Automobiles, agri-food, critical minerals, and renewable energy components, bypassing U.S. intermediaries entirely. Canadian manufacturers could export parts to Mexico for assembly, then ship finished products globally under preferential CPEP/U.K/EU terms. This consortium introduced integrated value chains, enabled by Mexico's low-cost labor and strategic nearshore facilities, combined with Canada's advanced tech and governance. Suddenly, factories in Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba fed into Mexico's vehicle and electronics hubs without U.S. involvement. Automotive production timelines shrank. Supply chains shortened. The corridor operated outside Trump's tariffs and drifted beyond Washington's tariff jurisdiction.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Energy trade also got reshaped. Western Canadian LNG pipelines, once slated for U.S. terminals, were redirected south into Mexico's new coastal regasification ports for onward export. A north-south fuel corridor now serves Asia-Pacific, ribboning through Mexico's Pacific hub rather than U.S. Gulf ports. The U.S. was left to watch as Canada cornered an LNG shortcut to global markets. On agriculture, Mexico reversed course. Instead of importing overpriced U.S. corn and soybeans burdened by retaliatory duties and trade friction, it turned to Canada and Brazil. Canada shipped pulses, grains, and processed foods at favorable rates. Mexican farmers reciprocated by exporting avocados, berries, and specialty crops directly to Canada under this new agreement, again bypassing U.S. tariffs and logistical choke points. Financial mechanisms followed suit. Dual currency trade settlements reduced reliance on the U.S. dollar. Banks in Toronto and Mexico City established cross-border payment channels in pesos and Canadian dollars. Mexico's new stock market uptick attracted Canadian institutional investors eager to support binational industrial integration. This financial realignment signaled a shift from dollars to regional economic autonomy. Even service industries were woven into the pact. Next-generation IT firms in Guadalajara and Monterrey opened R&D offices in Canada, supported by Calgary's investment funds. Educational institutions in Vancouver and Mexico City created dual-degree programs in robotics and biotech, feeding each other's labor pools instead of funneling to U.S. universities. Skilled migration pipelines emerged between the two countries, diversified and coordinated independently of U.S. visa systems. Beyond economics, the pact reflected shared values. Joint climate initiatives harmonized carbon pricing models. Quebec and British Columbia's frameworks interface with Mexico's cap-and-trade system. Cross-border green bonds finance solar, wind, and hydropower. Indigenous entrepreneurs from Canada's First Nations partner with Mexican smallholders to develop sustainable agroforestry, harnessing EU and UK green investment pipelines outside Washington's oversight. Technological alignment went deeper. Canada and Mexico began co-developing open-source industrial standards in automation and AI, benchmarked in CPTPP and monitored through intergovernmental working groups. This shared framework limited the dominance of U.S. proprietary systems and prevented tariffs on robotics and chips from interrupting continental tech growth. Infrastructure integration followed. Plans for an expanded rail network linking Winnipeg to Mexico's industrial belt emerged. New trucking corridors via U.S. border-adjacent zones were laid out to still pass through U.S. territory legally, while re-exporting goods across the continent. The U.S., for now, is a transit route, not a trade partner. Remarkably, all of this occurred without a formal tri-national agreement. It was crafted via executive collaboration. Provincial premiers, Mexican state governors, private sector leaders, driven by shared sport, trade, and climate forums taking place in Calgary, Guadalajara, and Toronto from 2023 to 2025. Structured behind the scenes and publicized as individual agreements, They formed a powerful networked alliance, an economic archipelago connecting Canada and Mexico in practice, if not yet law. In Washington, this blindsided the administration. Negotiators scrambled to re-engage both partners, but their earlier threats had hardened resolve. Official pressure was met with calm assurances of policy stability. Canada and Mexico weren't leaving the U.S. so much as diversify in case of future volatility. This phrase, carefully chosen, ended up carrying more risk than any tariff. U.S. industry groups quickly responded. Agri-lobbyists, automakers, and financial associations urged the White House to rethink its strategy. Even Michigan steel mills, hit by Canadian-U.S. steel duties, demanded relief. Yet domestic politics stymied serious corrections until bipartisan voices in Congress began drafting measures to reinstate trust, reopening parallel channels to both neighbors without tariffs or punitive clauses. Meanwhile, business confidence in Canada and Mexico soared. Portfolio inflows increased. Trade shows between the two nations flourished, and intercontinental shipping lanes radically improved. Regional policymakers, from Quebec to Jalisco, prioritized by national development zones, integrating Canadian tech parks with Mexican industrial clusters. Diplomatically, Vancouver and Mexico City began joint missions in Europe and Asia, promoting region-branded goods like North American green minerals and NA premium grains, appealing to European markets eager to diversify away from American supply pollution. These shared branding campaigns raised their global profile. Critically, cultural integration advanced. Manitoba's Cultural Export Office opened a Guadalajara branch, promoting Canadian art. Mexico's Tourism Board funded festivals in Calgary. In cities across both nations, there was a palpable sense of a new binational identity, a Pacific Latin corridor, poised to redefine geography over tariffs. By early 2025, this quiet cooperation had tangible results. A Canadian-Mexican passenger rail proposal gained momentum, promising to connect Calgary to Monterrey in under 24 hours via new freight lanes and upgraded tracks. A pilot green hydrogen project operated in Saskatchewan, destined for northern Mexico's industrial facilities, underwritten by shared climate finance frameworks independent of U.S. EPA or DOE influence. For the U.S., this meant missing not only trade volume, but cultural, financial, and technological influence. American exporters still required preference, but found themselves competing for space, and Goodwill Canada and Mexico were now offering each other, often favoring internal deals over American goods. U.S. tariffs became deterrents, not incentives. In a rare moment of bipartisan clarity, some U.S. lawmakers acknowledged that renegotiation must happen, not from a position of dominance, but collaborative inclusion. They began exploring options to rejoin CPTPP or negotiate a Canada-Mexico U.S. trilateral pact based on trust, not tariffs. Yet Canada and Mexico voiced caution. Their integration had proven effective precisely because it was built outside formal Washington fences. Any re-engagement would require genuine safeguards against coercion, legal assurances, tariff vetoes, and transparent dispute mechanisms co-authored by Ottawa and Mexico City. From the outset, in effect, the Trump-era tariff gambit backfired spectacularly. Rather than binding Canada closer, it drove them into each other's arms. The U.S. lost monopoly. Canada and Mexico gained autonomy. Washington is now navigating not just a tariff dispute, but profound realignment of North American cooperation. The real story here isn't just about trade routes or supply chains. It's about a massive psychological shift in how America's closest neighbors see themselves. For decades, the U.S. was the gravitational center of North America. Canada and Mexico orbited Washington, accepting second-tier status in economic negotiations, nodding politely while presidents posture about America's dominance. That era is over, and it ended not with a bang, but with a tariff. Trump's decision to weaponize trade against allies did something unprecedented. It gave them a common enemy. For the first time, Canada and Mexico stopped competing for Washington's approval and instead started building trust with each other. What began as a defensive maneuver quickly evolved into a forward-looking partnership. And now, that partnership is producing real, structural power. Let's talk aerospace. Bombardier, once a Canadian aviation powerhouse struggling under U.S. tariffs and Boeing lawsuits, inked a quiet deal with Mexican manufacturers in Querétaro. Together, they built a new joint venture focused on unmanned aerial vehicles, drones for commercial and agricultural use, targeting Asian and European markets. This venture, which doesn't rely on American parts or logistics, symbolizes something larger: that innovation and high-tech manufacturing can thrive in North America without the U.S. at the center. Or consider agriculture again. A new Canadian-Mexican grain exchange launched in late 2024 using blockchain technology to bypass U.S.-dominated pricing benchmarks. The goal? Price crops based on environmental sustainability, indigenous land use rights, and local labor standards, not Wall Street speculation. Farmers in Saskatchewan and Sinaloa are finally setting their own terms. It's a quiet revolution in how food is valued, and it excludes the U.S. entirely. Meanwhile, culture diplomacy is catching up to the economic transformation. Canadian music festivals now book Mexican acts as headliners instead of chasing American talent. Mexican universities are sending exchange students to McGill and UBC instead of California. Binational documentaries are premiering on streaming platforms without a single U.S. distributor involved. It's not just trade, it's identity. And that identity is increasingly defined by cooperation, sustainability, and self-respect. Not tariffs, threats, and drama. Let's not forget the environmental edge. While Trump dismantled U.S. climate initiatives and reapproved oil drilling in protected lands, Canada and Mexico doubled down on green infrastructure. A bilateral climate infrastructure council now reviews major projects across both countries to ensure they meet emissions and biodiversity standards. This body has become so respected that international investors now seek its stamp of approval before funding projects, further sidelining U.S. influence. In energy, a joint wind corridor is being developed across the Canadian prairies and Mexican highlands. Coordinated by both countries' federal energy regulators, this transcontinental project is set to power over 10 million homes across both countries, again, without U.S. involvement. In fact, American states are now seeking to purchase excess power from this Canada-Mexico grid, placing the U.S. in the uncomfortable position of asking for access to infrastructure it once assumed it would dominate. Even defense coordination is evolving. No, this isn't about tanks and warships, but about cybersecurity, pandemic response, and critical infrastructure. Canada and Mexico recently signed a memorandum to jointly develop and protect smart grids, telecom networks, and cross-border health data platforms. Why? Because under Trump, U.S. federal agencies became unreliable partners. The CDC was politicized. The NSA leaked trade secrets. FEMA failed. In that void, Canada and Mexico built their own institutional trust outside the traditional Three Amigos structure. And it's working. Public support is overwhelming. In a 2025 Ipsos poll, preliminary data available from internal sources, 76% of Canadians and 68% of Mexicans said they trust each other's governments more than they trust the U.S. administration on trade issues. That is staggering. These are not fringe views. They represent a generational realignment, a new continental logic. The financial markets are taking notice too. The Canadian dollar and Mexican peso, once heavily tethered to U.S. economic indicators, are now stabilizing based on bilateral trade flows. Regional banks are packaging cross-border investment products. Venture capital funds in Vancouver are co-investing with partners in Mexico City. U.S. investors, meanwhile, are either scrambling to get in or getting priced out. Back in Washington, there's confusion. Trump's White House continues to issue tariff threats as of its 2018. But the world has changed. When the administration announced a fresh 15% tariff on Mexican textiles in early 2025, expecting panic, Mexico calmly rerouted supply through Canada, slapped a reciprocal duty, and kept exports flowing. No drama, no collapse, just cold efficiency. That's the difference now. The U.S. yells. Canada and Mexico build. One performs for headlines. The others deliver for their people. Even global observers are noticing. Trade ministers from Germany, Japan, and the UK have begun negotiating Canada-Mexico specific deals without even looping in Washington. At a recent ASEAN summit, the Canadian and Mexican delegations were seated next to each other, not by accident, but because of how often they now present joint proposals on clean trade, labor standards, and digital economy rules. Washington, it turns out, is being slowly, methodically left behind. And here's the part that really stings. The U.S. is not just losing influence, it's losing relevance. Its neighbors are no longer seeking approval or reacting to intimidation. They're making their own future. And for the first time in a century, that future might not include the U.S. as the central player in North America. This isn't about anti-Americanism. It's about post-Americanism. A future where the U.S. is one partner among many, not the axis around which everything must spin. Canada and Mexico aren't looking for revenge. They're building resilience. They're not isolating the U.S. on purpose, but they're not waiting around either. And if Trump's trade war taught them anything, it's that they can and must chart their own course. Because trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. And in trade, as in life, trust is everything. And perhaps the most striking development of all is how quietly this transformation is happening. No press conferences, no photo ops, no dramatic declarations. Canada and Mexico aren't interested in bluster. They're interested in results. In stable prices, dependable supply chains, dignified diplomacy, and above all, self-determination. The irony is painful. As Trump puffs his chest and barks about making America great again, it's Canada and Mexico who are doing the hard work of actually rebuilding greatness for themselves. What does post-American North America look like in practice? It's a cross-border logistics hub in Monterrey that processes goods from British Columbia and ships them out of Pacific ports to Asia. It's a joint Canadian-Mexican vocational program training welders, electricians, and solar technicians for green projects from Baja to Quebec. It's a North American economic core that doesn't run through D.C., but instead flows laterally, creatively, and cooperatively between Ottawa and Mexico City. And let's talk about the broader global message this sends. To Europe, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific, Canada and Mexico are proving that middle powers don't have to play junior partners forever. They can set terms, build systems, and act with shared sovereignty. They can rewrite trade rules to serve people and planet, not just profits. They can prioritize worker dignity and community resilience over extractive bottom lines. And they can do it without asking for permission from Washington. That's why investment is pouring in. In 2025 alone, over 40 multinationals relocated regional headquarters from the U.S. to Canada or Mexico, citing stability, market access, and transparent governance. Japan's top battery manufacturer is building a joint plant in Alberta and Sonora. German automakers are designing North American EV models entirely within the Canada-Mexico trade zone. And digital startups in Guadalajara are now using Canadian AI infrastructure to deploy health tech apps across the hemisphere. All of this is possible because Trump and Trumpism made one fatal miscalculation. It assumed that the U.S. could bully its way to loyalty, that neighbors would tolerate humiliation because, after all, where else would they go? But they found somewhere else. They found each other. Now, as American policymakers begin to awaken to this new reality, they're faced with a haunting question. Is it too late? Because the shifts underway are not just reactive, they're generational. Young Canadians and Mexicans entering the workforce today are not being taught to view the U.S. as the default trading partner. They're being taught Mandarin. They're interning at binational companies. They're joining indigenous cooperatives, digital collectives, and green think tanks that speak the language of resilience and self-rule. They're building something that doesn't require permission or approval from anyone else. And the data reflects this. Youth surveys across Canada and Mexico show that fewer than 30% of young adults see the U.S. as a trusted long-term partner. That number was nearly 70% just a decade ago. The free fall is staggering, and it's not caused by anti-American sentiment. It's caused by disappointment. Disappointment in broken promises, in sudden tariffs, in racist rhetoric, in the trashing of climate agreements, in the chaos of American politics that makes trust and contracts meaningless. What this generation understands is that economic security isn't about bravado, it's about collaboration. And collaboration is rooted in respect. Mark Carney understood that from day one. So did his Mexican counterpart. Together, They become the architects of a new North American architecture, one that no longer orbits around U.S. egos, but around shared interest and shared future. And that's the real lesson here. Power in the 21st century is not just about who controls the biggest economy or the biggest army. It's about who can be trusted, who keeps their word, who shows up with solutions, not threats. That's the currency of the modern world. And right now, it's Canada and Mexico who are cashing in. Meanwhile, Trump's America is burning its credibility like dry kindling, tariff threats, diplomatic walkouts. Twitter insults masquerading as policy, all while allies recalibrate, restructure, and quietly move on. But maybe this is the natural arc of empire. Maybe every superpower eventually mistakes dominance for permanence. And when it does, its neighbors start building exits, trade exits, diplomatic exits, emotional exits. And those exits, once built, become permanent. Canada and Mexico aren't turning their backs on the U.S. out of hostility. They're walking forward because they've learned that looking back is a waste of time. So now, with every solar panel made in a joint Canadian-Mexican factory, with every container grain shipped from a co-owned port to Asia, with every young entrepreneur who builds an app that bypasses U.S. servers, the message becomes louder. We don't need to beg for access. We can build alternatives. And we already are. That's what should terrify Washington. Not the loss of a tariff fight, but the loss of relevance. Because once the world sees that it's possible to do trade, diplomacy, and development without being hostage to U.S. volatility, others will follow. The alliances that built the post-war world will not vanish overnight, but they will loosen, reconfigure, and eventually transform into something new, something multipolar, something post-American. And at the heart of that new order, quiet powerhouses like Canada and Mexico, countries that refuse to be bullied, that turn trade pain into political clarity, that bet on dignity over dependence, and won. As for Trump, he can hold his press conferences. He can bluster about greatness. He can slap new tariffs on allies who no longer fear him. But the truth is, the future has already moved on. Canada and Mexico are not waiting to be invited back into America's good graces. They're already rewriting the rules, without permission and without regret. And in the end, that's the biggest blow of all. Not just that Trump lost the trade war, but that the world finally realized it didn't need him to win.